I'm Sanda Ojiambo, the CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. For 20 years now, the Global Compact has mobilized companies around the world to align their operations and strategies in the world's largest sustainability initiative with our 10 principles focused on human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption as our roadmap. Fighting corruption at every level is key to our ambition. The adoption of the Convention Against Corruption by the UN General Assembly in 2003 sent a clear message that the international community will work together to address corruption in the public and private sectors. The Convention inspired our 10th principle, which commits our participants not only to implement anti-corruption policies and programs across their operations, but also to collaborate with civil society, the United Nations, and governments towards more transparent and accountable business. Combating corruption is even more important in our COVID-19 era, as the pandemic challenges good governance and public trust in the rule of law. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with the president of the 75th session of the UN General Assembly, Volkan Bozkir, about the upcoming special session. In our discussion, President Bozkir briefs the international community and the private sector on the preparations leading up to the special session, the role of the private sector in supporting anti-corruption work, and the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption itself. I hope our conversation will leave you not only informed, but also inspired to accelerate our collective effort in the fight against corruption. Hello, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well, Sanda. It's wonderful to see you today outside of our Gender Advisory Group meetings. We rarely get to sit down and chat.
Yes, indeed, Mr. President. And I have to say, it is a privilege to serve on your Gender Advisory Group. May I ask, how does this work on gender equality support your mandate? And can you share more about your work as the President of the General Assembly?
Well, when I took office back in September, we were straight into high-level week. And this is one of the unusual things about the office. I was elected in early summer, but I took office just 1 week before the United Nations General Assembly itself took hold. Of course, this was a very different kind of United Nations General Assembly as the COVID-19 pandemic took hold of the world. Yet a record number of world leaders addressed the general debate, and the high-level event on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the first ever Summit on Biodiversity, the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, and of course, the high-level meeting to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women. It had been a quarter of a century since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was adopted. And it was clear from listening to member states on that day that we had much work to do. And I felt compelled to sign up as an international gender champion. And I had the idea to establish the advisory group on gender equality in order to work towards mainstreaming gender equality throughout the work of the General Assembly. The member states also mandated the office to organize the special session on COVID-19 response in December. Few presidents have the opportunity to organize one special session, yet alone two. But I'm delighted that in the historic 75th year, my office has the opportunity to prepare for two special sessions of the United Nations General Assembly on two critical issues of concern, the COVID-19 virus and the scourge of corruption.
Indeed, Mr. President. And the upcoming UNGAS will address challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthen international cooperation, which of course are among the key objectives of the UN Convention Against Corruption that's been adopted by the General Assembly in the year 2003.
Yes, Sanda. First of all, it is important to note that the UN Convention Against Corruption was adopted by consensus. The world agreed that a global anti-corruption instrument was required. In fact, with almost universal adherence, this commitment to end corruption has been steadfast. 187 parties to the convention recognize that the UN Convention Against Corruption is the only comprehensive international legal instrument, we have to prevent and combat corruption and promote cooperation among states. As I'm sure you know, a full chapter of the Convention is dedicated to the recovery and return of stolen assets. Its unique peer review mechanism sets it apart, and the Convention assists states, parties, to take stock of their implementation efforts, identify implementation gaps, and also provides the technical assistance to fill those gaps. While the Convention is legally binding for all states that have ratified and acceded to it, the Convention also has direct impact to the private sector.
Yes, Mr. President, and indeed, while the private sector does not directly sign up to the Convention, it is very much impacted by its implementation. So may I ask, Mr. President, how do you see the progress and success of the international community in implementing the Convention so far?
In terms of evaluating progress, the review of implementation takes place in two 5-year cycles. The first cycle started in 2010, and 94% of the states' parties completed their reviews. Over 1,000 good practices were identified, and 6,331 recommendations were issued for governments to step up their implementation efforts. The second cycle is underway since 2015, and 50 states have finalized their reviews. So far, 167 good implementing practices have been identified, and 857 recommendations to better implement the Convention were issued. I'm delighted that almost all the governments reported taking action to implement recommendations received, including measures to facilitate citizens' access to information, to increase transparency in public procurement, and to ensure that all the offenses of corruption foreseen by the Convention are criminalized. On the other hand, many states have indicated that they will need support to improve capacity, knowledge, legal frameworks, and public institutions. However, this was foreseen, in fact. The mechanism to review the implementation of the Convention enables us to identify and prioritize the type of assistance required so that we can implement the Convention and fight corruption effectively.
So if I could follow up on that, then what kind of assistance really is envisaged?
Assistance ranges from education, training, and capacity building to advisory services to adopt and implement effective anti-corruption laws. To assistance is establish strong institutions such as anti-corruption authorities. Indeed, these are priority areas for many developing countries. And during the follow-up phase to the second review cycle, that governments will be asked to provide information on the progress achieved in connection with the observations of their first phase reviews, and also whether technical assistance requested by them has been provided. We will have to be patient, as that is the time to assess how effective our implementation efforts have been.
Thank you so much for that insight, Mr. President. And it's truly encouraging to see such progress made on the implementation of the Convention by governments. The private sector has also been playing a significant role in the implementation of the Convention. At the UN Global Compact, we've seen that many of our business participants are developing policies and programs on anti-corruption and engaging in collective action. So looking ahead to June, what then, Mr. President, are the objectives of the special session?
You know, this is the first time that the General Assembly has called for a special session against corruption. Since 2003, Member States have demonstrated their commitment to end corruption in tandem with a recognition that here in the General Assembly we're expected to utilize all of the tools at our disposal to meet the needs of the people we serve. Corruption undermines public trust in institutions and democracy and threatens security and social cohesion. Corruption is, of course, a global problem that cannot be tackled by one country or one actor alone. And it is a global issue which requires a multilateral response. The United Nations special session will provide a space for governments and all key stakeholders to learn from each other's best practices and to assess the existing architecture. And I hope it will energize the membership to fully and effectively implement the convention.
That is an ambitious agenda, to be sure. And what outcomes would you expect, Mr. President?
I believe the UNGAS will focus political attention on ending corruption. This will be a clear moment of reckoning for the international community. And the high-level political declaration will be the key outcome and will signal clear political commitment to ending corruption. But, in my view, it is much more than that. It will serve as a roadmap of principles, ideas, and measures that need to be implemented for the anti-corruption agenda to move forward. I trust that governments will adequately fund their implementation efforts so that we can move the needle in this decade of action.
Indeed. And one of the mandates outlined in the resolution on the special session against corruption is the adoption of a concise and action-oriented political declaration. How do you think this declaration will change the global efforts to prevent and fight corruption?
Well, the negotiations are taking place as we speak, so I won't put the cart before the horse. But the draft political declaration contains sections on preventive measures, criminalization and law enforcement, international cooperation, asset recovery, technical assistance and information sharing, cross-cutting emerging issues, as well as a forward-looking section. The draft highlights corruption as an impediment to the achievement of the 2030 agenda and calls on the UN system to serve as a role model in the fight against corruption, to increase coordination and cooperation internally and with other organizations. So the draft also takes note of the work of the Factor Panel, which proposes a number of recommendations aimed at establishing a global pact for financial integrity. Delegations will also discuss international cooperation and asset recovery. And I'm happy to hear that there is a real sense of determination and delegations are working constructively to make progress. Topics are still discussed, include international cooperation and asset recovery, in particular ways to make these processes more efficient and less burdensome for requesting states. At this stage, ideas are still being discussed extensively, so I expect negotiations to conclude by 7th of May before onward transmission to the General Assembly here in New York.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's really wonderful. Lots of information and insights, and we look forward to learning more in May. Your Excellency, what then is the role of the private sector, civil society, academic institutions, and other key stakeholders ensuring that UNGAS becomes truly a turning point in the global fight against corruption? And how can we drive collective action to increase impact?
I'm glad you're asking me this, dear Sanda, as you are truly the fulcrum between the United Nations and the private sector. Earlier, I stated that ending corruption requires a multilateral response, but this must take the form of a whole-of-society approach. All stakeholders must be committed to taking collective action to tackle corruption effectively. I truly hope that representatives of the private sector, the United Nations system, all relevant international and regional organizations, civil society, academia, and other relevant stakeholders to fully contribute to the UNGAS preparatory process in accordance with the relevant rules of procedure and established practice. In addition, I will convene a high-level supporting event on the margins of the special session, which will include interactive elements in order to facilitate the participation of a range of stakeholders.
This is really great to hear, Mr. President, and turning the tide against corruption indeed requires a collective effort from all stakeholders. As I'm sure you know, the UN Convention Against Corruption is the underlying legal instrument of the 10th principle of the UN Global Compact, where it explicitly states that businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. And as such, I'm sure our members will ask, how do they then get involved?
The UN Office on Drugs and Crime was mandated by the General Assembly to collect contributions of stakeholders through their website. So this includes specific recommendations on the issues to be addressed by the General Assembly at its special session. I urge everyone who is interested to submit their ideas and suggestions there.
I agree, and I encourage interested parties to submit their contributions as well. You know, in May 2020, the UN Global Compact submitted a contribution calling upon governments to firstly recall the intention and the spirit of the UN Convention Against Corruption and to reaffirm and strengthen their commitment to its founding tenets and ultimately to enhance transparency and integrity. Secondly, to build robust and resilient systems, and thirdly, to promote greater collaboration through collective action and multilateralism. Now, turning to the current pandemic, on 30th November 2020, Mr. President, you launched an initiative called Vaccines for All, calling on UN member states to support global multilateral efforts to achieve fair and equitable access to vaccines. So as COVID-19 vaccines are being rolled out across the globe, how can the private sector support UN member states' efforts to ensure that vaccines are fairly and equitably accessible to all people everywhere? And similarly, how can the private sector help ensure that corruption does not undermine these much-needed efforts?
Well, Sanda, if we are to emerge from the COVID-19 crisis and recover better, we need viable vaccines that are fairly and equitably accessible to everyone, everywhere. And we know from past experiences that vaccines only work if a critical threshold of people are covered. It is therefore a moral and practical imperative that we leave no one behind. I have been pleased to see the substantial support for the World Health Organization-led ACT, Accelerator and its COVAX facility, which seeks to ensure that vaccine access is fair and equitable. This mechanism and other initiatives that aim to bolster it, such as UNICEF's distribution systems, must be supported with political and financial resources to ensure success. From the earliest days of this presidency, I have stressed that the world has an obligation to provide vaccines for all. And this was underscored at the special session on COVID-19 in December of last year. In March, 181 member states brought forth a political declaration on equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, demonstrating the bold and principled solidarity of the membership. In our urgent efforts to vaccinate the world, we must remain vigilant regarding the threat of corruption. As with any commodity, there are corruption risks throughout the manufacturing and distribution processes, as organized criminal groups seek to take advantage of COVID-19 pandemic by attacking vulnerabilities and gaps in health and criminal systems. So the risk is particularly pronounced when supplies are limited and demand is high, as is the case during a pandemic. COVID-19 vaccines have been developed in record time, and researchers continue to develop diagnostics and booster vaccinations. The scientists are doing their part. Healthcare workers are doing their part on the front lines. Now, it is our turn. We must prevent corruption if we are to ensure vaccines for all.
Absolutely, Mr. President, and I really couldn't agree more. The private sector does indeed play a key role in ensuring the equitable procurement and distribution of vaccines for all. In these critical times, companies must put the profit motive aside and look at the vaccine as a public good by ensuring fair pricing, transparency, and wide accessibility. We know that many of the current COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing companies are Global Compact participants, which already signals their commitment towards responsible business practices and supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, Mr. President, I must ask you, how would you say that the current COVID-19 crisis changes the UNGA's process?
The COVID-19 pandemic is the defining challenge of our times, and I firmly believe that the General Assembly needs to be fully functioning in order to deal with the pandemic and its consequences. As such, we have adapted some of our working methods to keep the delegations and UN staff safe and healthy. However, as negotiations on the high-level political declaration are taking place in Vienna, we have not experienced much disruption to our preparations here in New York. My team and I regularly speak to our colleagues at the UN office on drugs and crime and with delegations here in New York. Rest assured, we are gaining momentum as we move towards June, and I, for one, cannot wait.
Likewise, Mr. President, and I truly look forward to joining you then. Thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you, Sanda. It was my pleasure.
I hope you all found this discussion illuminating and inspiring. As we heard from the President, all stakeholders must be committed to taking collective action to tackle corruption effectively. The Global Compact recognizes the importance of collective action against corruption through our programs and our initiatives that we run through our 69 local networks. Our new strategy calls for us to accelerate and scale up the collective impact of business by upholding our 10 principles and delivering the Sustainable Development Goals. Accountable companies and ecosystems that enable change are critical. A multilateral response is critical to fighting corruption and working towards achieving the 2030 Agenda. No one country or company can combat corruption alone. As we prepare for the June special session, I urge all leaders to pay particular attention to the dangers of corruption in our uncertain times, and we look forward to a successful special session so that corruption no longer impedes the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals.